am stressed. Within 2 weeks, I have a deadline for a research paper and there's no time left. I've had all these cups of coffee. My heart rate is increasing. I haven't slept in weeks. I don't know if I can take this any longer. I also need to stay in touch with my friends. I need to make sure that I post something on Instagram. I need to make sure that I contact them, that I respond on their messages on WhatsApp. What to do? What to do? I don't know how I can move further as from here. In this video, I will explain to you what stress is, what prolonged stress means, and how actually prolonged amount of stress can result in burnout complaints. Check it out. Almost every day when I open the newspaper, I come across an article that is pointed towards the increase in mental health complaints. And not only within working parents, but we also see that the younger generation is suffering from these complaints. And it actually amazes me, it surprises me, that we see that more and more youngsters are suffering from mental health complaints, such as burnout, such as stress complaints, such as daily levels of fatigue and anxiety problems. And you know, it's quite easy to say that you're stressed. I mean, quite often when someone asks you how you're doing, the first response you have is, I'm busy, I'm a bit stressed. So the question here is, what is stress? And stress actually is a term that originates from engineering. It means that there's external pressure that is put onto someone. And this in turn results in tension, it results in strain. To a certain extent, people can actually deal with strain as long as they recover. So I always compare it to a hike in the forest, a hike on a mountain. If you start your hike, if you start your walk and you have your backpack on, you can actually deal with the backpack. And you can deal with the backpack for quite a bit of time, even though you feel the strain on your shoulders, until a certain moment you really have the feeling that it gets too much. At that moment, you take a break, you take a sip of water, you sit down, you recover. And by recovering, you can continue your hike. Now, if you do not recover, the tension, the strain that is put onto you prolongs. And at that moment, there might be a point where you cannot deal with that external pressure anymore. In order to better understand stress, we can take a look at the cognitive appraisal perspective. And what we see is that once you encounter a stressor, this may result in stress. So something happens in your environment, a stressor happens, and in turn your body responds to this stressor. Here we see that, for example, when your boss screams to you, this may result in enhanced stress. And you may, for example, experience an increased heart rate or intense breathing. In turn, this may result in diminished performance at work. The extent to which the stressor results in stress may depend on certain threshold values. And these threshold values may be situational or personal factors. So this might be individual differences or the way you cope with something. The more resilient you are, the easier you are able to actually deal with that stressor, to deal with the screaming boss, and you don't let it affect you too much. Whereas for someone else, it might actually result in enhanced stress. Furthermore, momentary states, meaning that, for example, when your cat passed away the day before, you might not feel really well, and the screaming boss might actually be more intense towards you on that day than it would normally be. We see that there are actually two types of stressors. First of all, we have acute stressors. Acute stressors would, for example, mean increased heart rate, increased vigilance, or heavy amount of breathing. This happens, for example, when you get back from a night out and you look in your pocket and you cannot find your mobile phone anymore. That feeling, that is acute stress. Secondly, we have chronic stress. And chronic stress means that you experience this over a prolonged amount of time. For example, when you have too much work to do. And when this happens, this may result in increased amounts of fatigue, or it may even result in higher risk of heart disease and diabetes. Now, if you experience job or study stress, this may be evoked by demanding situations, meaning that the negative emotions that you encounter are actually caused by a demanding situation either at work or during your job. And you don't have enough resources to actually cope with this. So for example, you may feel tired, you may feel sad, you may feel down. These negative emotions are caused by demanding situations. So for example, you are having your exam week, you are having a side job, or maybe you experience problems with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. And if you don't have enough resources, so for example, you don't experience that you have enough support, or you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money, you don't have enough energy in order to cope with these difficult situations. Now, when you're more often for longer periods of time experiencing chronic stress without taking enough breaks to recover or to rest, you build up a recovery deficit, meaning that you don't recover as much as you actually need. So by doing so, your body will increase the amount of stress hormones in your body in order to compensate for that recovery deficit. You can still go back to your normal speed, but taking the braking distance will be even longer. And this actually results in a permanent alarm mode, which is also called past distress, or in Dutch, overspannenheid. At this moment, the brake doesn't work anymore. You get complaints such as tiredness, concentration problems, not eating, maybe anxiety complaints. And this is your body signaling that you need to stop, because this is the alarm mode. If you continue going this left lane, you will get into total exhaustion, depletion. And how Max Verstappen would experience this is where the gas pedal and the brake don't work anymore. And the moment you have the feeling that your gas and your brake don't work anymore, you encounter that prolonged experience of stress, which may in turn result in burnout complaints and eventually in a burnout. And a burnout is a work or study related problem, psychological health problem, which is a reaction to prolonged amount of stress. Let's take a look at what this means. So the two core factors of burnout include fatigue and exhaustion. This is exemplified by the definition of Pines and Aronson. And they define burnout as a state of physical and emotional exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in situations that are emotionally taxing. Now we see that when people encounter burnout complaints, when they get into a burnout, they experience emotional exhaustion, depersonalization and cynicism, and reduced personal accomplishments. These are the three things that are most often mentioned that are experienced. Now, depersonalization means that it's the detachment of yourself from your body and your mind. So what happens is that when someone experiences this, he or she feels like they're watching their lives from a movie perspective. Now, if we want to talk about stress and self-regulation, we actually also need to talk about the different parts of the brain. And I will shortly go through the three most important aspects. First of all, we see here the amygdala. And the amygdala is the emotional part of the brain, which is actually also called your guard dog. For example, when you are crossing a road and you see a car, the amygdala is the one that awares you, so you can actually jump back. Secondly, you see the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is the bit of your brain that will help you with learning. That is the one that helps you make wise decisions. This is where all the thinking happens. So this is also called the wise owl. And finally, we see the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is your saver. This is where you save all your memories. It helps you actually to become a positive and optimistic thinker. Now, I can tell you that the way you use these three key players in your brain determines how you can deal with different situations. As I just mentioned, if this is your brain and this is the prefrontal cortex, we see that when you are in a calm state of mind, the three different players, they work in line and you can easily make decisions, because the first thing what happens is that the prefrontal cortex helps you to think, helps you to reflect. Now, the moment you get into a stressed state of mind, this is what happens. The prefrontal cortex flips the lid and the amygdala, which is underneath, takes over. That is the emotional part of the brain. So when you're in a state of stress, you don't think, you don't reflect. It flips the lid and you get into this emotional part of the brain. So it is like having a glass of water, and the glass of water gets dirt in there. When your mind is calm and clear, like when there's no dirt in a glass, the information is able to pass successfully from one part of the brain to the other parts of the brain. And if we need to store or retrieve our memories, we can access those through our hippocampus and with great ease actually. And if we need to solve complex problems, if we need to make connections, or when you need to focus or concentrate, the information is able to travel to our prefrontal cortex where the learning is taking place. In contrast, when the mind is anxious or in a state of stress, the mind becomes like this glass full of dirt and water. The information is directly sent to our amygdala, our fight, flight and freeze modus, as opposed to where it actually needs to go. So like this glass of dirt, the mind becomes cloudy and unfocused. The information swirls around and it is much harder for information to get where it needs to go. And I can imagine that you can also think of a time when your mind felt like this. Think about when it was hard to focus, hard to remember things, and hard to keep information straight. Now what we see happening is that our mind cannot say the difference anymore between a true emergency and just a stressful situation. So what you need to learn to do is to tell your mind when something is actually a stressful situation and your amygdala, your emotional brain needs to respond. So for example, when you are crossing that street and the car is coming, and when it's just stress because of exams. And are you able to take that step back and make the glass clear again? In the next lecture, I will go more into depth on underlying theories and models, explaining stress and explaining burnout complaints. So stay tuned and I'll see you during the next video.